In American history, few mysteries linger as darkly as the quiet rise of Abraham Lincoln, a man born in a log cabin who seemed perpetually out of place among generals, senators, and polished elites, yet somehow destined to command the nation at its moment of collapse. He entered politics with no formal education, an awkward frame, and a voice often mocked. But when the United States fractured into civil war, this unlikely figure became the axis on which the future turned. The shock lies not only in his leadership during the bloodiest conflict America had ever known, but in the paradox he embodied: a deeply compassionate man who authorized total war, a reluctant emancipator who reshaped human freedom, a humorist who carried unbearable grief. Rumors swirled around him even in his own time. Visions of death dreamt days before it arrived. Stories of spiritual fatalism. A sense among friends that Lincoln believed his life was only borrowed, not owned. He walked the White House halls at night like a haunted man, shoulders bent not just by responsibility, but by the weight of hundreds of thousands of dead, questioning whether saving the Union justified the cost. And then comes the final riddle: how a leader who survived political assassination attempts, military disasters, and 4 relentless years of war could be struck down just as victory arrived, turning a living president into an eternal martyr in a single gunshot. Was Lincoln merely a skilled politician shaped by circumstance, or a tragic figure who understood from the beginning that his role required ultimate sacrifice? To uncover the truth behind the myth, the contradictions, and the man himself, we must step back into the shadows of his life and follow the path that led a self-taught lawyer to alter the course of history forever. Imagine a warm April night in Washington, the war officially over, but the silence not yet settled. And visualize Abraham Lincoln seated in a narrow theater box, his tall frame folded awkwardly into a chair built for comfort rather than consequence. The gas lights flicker, the audience laughs, and the nation exhales for the first time in 4 years. Victory has arrived, yet it arrives unevenly, like a breath taken after near drowning. The question that hovers over this moment is not whether the Union has survived, but whether the man who carried it can ever step down from the weight he has become. What does it mean to save a nation built on contradiction? And what must be paid by the person who does the saving? Whether you're still tossing and turning in bed, driving down the highway, or simply looking for a wallpaper to work with, grab your phone with 65% battery and join me for today's story. If I guess correctly, leave a like. If wrong, comment your current battery percentage. The laughter inside Ford's theater rolls forward like a gentle tide, unaware of how close it is to breaking. Lincoln smiles faintly, not the smile of delight, but the practiced expression of relief, the look of a man allowing himself, briefly, to rest. He has spent 4 years measuring words, rationing hope, and counting the dead in numbers too large to feel real. Tonight, for a few unguarded minutes, he is not a commander issuing orders, not a politician absorbing hatred, not a father burying a son. He is simply present. Yet presence, for Lincoln, has always been dangerous. He is most vulnerable not when he is struggling upward, but when he pauses. The war has stripped him down to essentials. It has taught him that power is never clean, that leadership is not triumph but endurance, and that moral clarity often arrives only after irreparable loss. He did not begin this journey as a conqueror, nor even as a confident reformer. He began it as a man trying to hold something together long enough to understand what it truly was. The Union, in his hands, became less a structure and more a living contradiction, breathing through compromise, bleeding through conflict, and surviving through patience. As the play unfolds below, Lincoln's thoughts drift, not forward into celebration, but backward into reckoning. He remembers how fragile this victory feels, how easily it could have slipped away. He remembers nights in the White House, pacing alone, shoes worn thin, shoulders bent under letters of grief from mothers who had given everything. He remembers choosing delay over decisiveness, mercy over anger, and restraint over revenge, not because these choices were easy, but because the alternatives would have consumed what little remained. This moment at Ford's Theater is not an ending. It is a suspension. The nation has survived, but it has not healed. The president has won, but he has not rested. His mind circles the work that remains, the harder work that begins after the guns fall silent. Reconstruction is a word already heavy with danger, promising reconciliation but threatening retaliation. He knows how thin the line is between justice and vengeance, between memory and bitterness. He knows that victory can intoxicate, and that intoxication can undo what discipline has built. Lincoln's life has been shaped by thresholds like this one, moments when momentum pauses and character is revealed. He has always stood at the edge of collapse rather than at the center of triumph. He was never the most brilliant man in the room, never the most refined, never the most commanding in appearance. He was great, not because he moved faster than others, but because he endured longer. He was great, not because he avoided doubt, but because he lived inside it without surrendering to it. The theater itself becomes a symbol of that contradiction, a place of entertainment transformed into a chamber of history, a moment of comedy poised above catastrophe. The crowd's laughter echoes against walls that will soon hold silence, and that silence will ripple outward, changing how this night is remembered. For now, though, Lincoln remains unaware, leaning forward slightly, hands resting on his knees, his face marked by fatigue, and something quieter, something like acceptance. Acceptance has never meant resignation for him. It has meant understanding limits. He understands now that the war did not cleanse the nation. It exposed it. It did not resolve the problem of freedom. It forced it into the open. The union he preserved is not a finished structure, but a question still being asked. What does equality demand? What does unity cost? Who bears the burden when ideals collide with reality? This is the man we meet at the beginning of this story, not as a myth, not as a monument, but as a figure balanced between consequence and legacy. His life will soon be reduced to images, phrases, and carved stone. But tonight, he is still unfinished. The arc that brought him here stretches backward into hardship, obscurity, and repeated failure. It winds through private despair and public ridicule, through moral awakening and political calculation. Every choice he made carried the risk of collapse, and many nearly did. The significance of this night lies not only in what will happen, but in what has already been endured. Lincoln sits at the summit of his influence. Yet that summit feels narrow and unstable. He has climbed not by force, but by patience, not by certainty, but by reflection. And as the laughter swells one last time, the question that frames his entire life presses closer. Can a man shaped by doubt, loss, and restraint hold together a nation defined by extremes? Or does the act of holding it together require a final, irrevocable sacrifice? The story does not rush forward from this moment. It pauses, breath held, inviting us to step backward and trace the long, uneven road that led here. Because to understand the silence that follows, we must first understand the voice that carried so far and the life that shaped it. The road back from that theater night carries us not toward marble halls or cheering crowds, but into a cabin pressed low against the American frontier, where beginnings were not celebrated and survival itself felt provisional. Abraham Lincoln entered the world in rural Kentucky, a place where the soil resisted cultivation and the future resisted certainty. The land offered no generosity, only endurance, and from his earliest days, he learned that existence was something earned daily, not promised by birth or station. His childhood was defined less by moments than by absences: absence of security, absence of comfort, absence of continuity. The family moved when the ground beneath them failed, when legal claims collapsed, when hope thinned. Kentucky gave way to Indiana, not as a planned ascent, but as a retreat from loss. Each relocation stripped away what little stability had been built, teaching Lincoln that attachment carried risk, and that permanence was a luxury few could afford. The frontier was not romantic. It was isolating, repetitive, and unforgiving. Days blurred into labor, and labor blurred into identity. From sunrise to nightfall, survival demanded physical effort, leaving little room for reflection or play. The young Lincoln learned to split rails, clear fields, and wrest sustenance from reluctant earth. His body grew tall and strong, but his mind learned something subtler: that effort did not guarantee reward, and that failure was often arbitrary. Loss arrived early and without ceremony. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, died when he was just 9 years old, taken by illness in a place where medicine was scarce and grief had no vocabulary. The death was not dramatized. It simply occurred, leaving behind a quiet void that shaped him more than any lesson. Her absence did not inspire bitterness, but it cultivated an intimacy with sorrow that never left him. He learned that love could vanish suddenly, and that endurance meant carrying memory without surrendering to it. This early confrontation with mortality did not harden him into indifference. It sharpened his awareness. He became observant, inward, and unusually sensitive to the suffering of others. While other children expressed grief through anger or rebellion, Lincoln absorbed it silently, storing it away as part of his internal landscape. Sadness became familiar terrain, not an enemy to be defeated, but a condition to be understood. Loneliness followed naturally. Frontier life offered few companions, fewer distractions, and almost no structured education. Formal schooling came sporadically, measured in months rather than years. Yet the lack of instruction did not extinguish curiosity. On the contrary, scarcity intensified desire. Books, when they appeared, were treated as artifacts rather than objects. He read by firelight, memorizing passages, copying language into his mind as though preserving it against disappearance. The rhythm of his days trained him in patience. Nothing on the frontier moved quickly. Crops took seasons, not weeks. Travel took days, not hours. Answers arrived slowly, if at all. This temporal drag taught Lincoln to think in long arcs rather than short gains. He learned to wait, to endure, and to accept uncertainty as a permanent condition rather than a temporary inconvenience. Indiana, in particular, etched these lessons deeply. The land was harsh, the winters long, and the social world narrow. Yet, it was here that Lincoln's character began to cohere. He developed a habit of reflection, a tendency to measure words before speaking, and a preference for listening over assertion. These traits would later be mistaken for weakness, but they were forged in an environment where miscalculation carried immediate consequences. The frontier also exposed him early to human contradiction. He saw kindness and cruelty coexist in close quarters. Neighbors relied on one another for survival, yet disputes over land and labor could erupt into lasting feuds. Authority was informal, justice uneven, and morality shaped more by necessity than by principle. From this, Lincoln learned that law was not an abstraction, but a fragile agreement between flawed people. His relationship with his father was complex, shaped by respect for effort, but tension over aspiration. The elder Lincoln valued physical labor and practical survival, while the son felt drawn toward words, ideas, and questions that could not be measured by immediate utility. This divergence created distance, reinforcing Lincoln's sense of being inwardly alone, even within family. Yet, it also clarified his identity. He would not escape hardship by rejecting it, but by understanding it. Hard beginnings did not give him confidence. They gave him humility. He did not grow up believing the world owed him recognition. He grew up believing the world owed nothing at all. This belief became a source of resilience rather than despair. It freed him from entitlement and trained him to measure success not by ease, but by persistence. The intimacy with loss established in these early years became a defining feature of his moral imagination. He did not speak of suffering as a concept. He recognized it as a condition. This recognition later allowed him to address national trauma without abstraction, to speak of sacrifice and grief with authenticity rather than rhetoric. He understood that pain could not be erased, only honored and endured. Lincoln does not yet know what shape his future will take. There is no sense of destiny, no foreshadowing of power. There is only a young man shaped by land that refused generosity, by family that endured without promise, and by loss that arrived without explanation. These hard beginnings do not elevate him. They strip him down, and in that stripping, they quietly prepare him for a life defined not by triumph alone, but by the capacity to carry weight without breaking. The frontier that shaped Lincoln's body also sharpened his hunger for something beyond it. In a world where labor consumed daylight and exhaustion claimed the night, he discovered a private rebellion that required neither permission nor wealth. It began quietly, almost invisibly, with books borrowed, rescued, or stumbled upon, and with words absorbed as though they were sustenance rather than ornament. By firelight, when others slept, he read not to impress, but to survive obscurity. Self-education was not a choice made in comfort. It was an act of discipline carved out of fatigue. After days spent splitting rails and clearing land, his arms aching and his back bent. He opened pages that demanded concentration rather than rest. Each sentence slowed him, forced him to think, and trained him to remain still in a life defined by motion. Reading became his first form of resistance, a refusal to accept that circumstance defined capacity. Books were scarce, which made them sacred. He read whatever he could find, not guided by curriculum, but by instinct. History offered him patterns of rise and fall. Biography revealed how ordinary origins could precede extraordinary consequences. Law introduced structure into a world that felt arbitrary. Language itself became a fascination, not merely for what it conveyed, but for how it conveyed it. He learned that meaning was not accidental, that words carried weight when shaped with care. This solitary education did more than inform him. It disciplined him. Reading demanded patience, and patience became a habit. Writing demanded clarity, and clarity became standard. He copied passages repeatedly, refining not just memory, but precision. Over time, this repetition trained his mind to resist haste. He learned to slow down thought, to examine arguments, and to recognize when emotion threatened to outrun reason. Law, in particular, offered him a kind of order he had never known. On the frontier, disputes were resolved through force, compromise, or endurance. Law promised something else, a framework where reason could prevail over impulse, where disagreement could be processed rather than fought. For Lincoln, law was not an abstract system. It was a moral technology, a way of containing human conflict without denying its existence. His attraction to language grew alongside this discovery. He became attentive to rhythm, balance, and simplicity. He noticed that powerful ideas did not require elaborate expression, only honest structure. He learned to strip sentences down until nothing unnecessary remained. This restraint was not stylistic modesty. It was ethical discipline. Words, he believed, should clarify rather than dominate. This self-imposed discipline also shaped his emotional life. Brooding gave him distance from his own despair, allowing him to examine suffering as a condition shared across time rather than a personal burden alone. Through stories and arguments, he encountered grief that did not destroy, failure that did not erase dignity, and struggle that did not preclude meaning. These encounters did not cure his melancholy, but they contextualized it, transforming pain into something intelligible rather than overwhelming. Unlike formal education, his learning had no external validation. There were no grades, no degrees, no mentors to affirm progress. This absence forced him inward. He learned to measure growth by internal standards, to trust quiet improvement rather than public recognition. This habit would later allow him to endure ridicule and dismissal without abandoning conviction. Language became his refuge and his weapon. Through it, he could step beyond physical limitation and engage ideas larger than himself. Through it, he could test arguments without raising his voice. Through it, he could imagine futures not visible from the fields he worked. His speech, when it emerged, carried the mark of this discipline. It was deliberate, spare, and rooted in reason rather than flourish. This period also sharpened his moral awareness. Exposure to political philosophy, legal reasoning, and historical struggle forced him to confront contradictions rather than evade them. He learned that societies often proclaimed ideals they failed to practice, and that progress rarely arrived cleanly. These realizations did not radicalize him, they tempered him. He became cautious, aware that certainty often concealed arrogance. The firelight under which he studied became symbolic of his method. It illuminated only a small area at a time, requiring focus rather than breadth. He did not attempt to master everything at once. He moved sentence by sentence, argument by argument, allowing understanding to accumulate slowly. This incremental approach would later define his leadership style, one that favored persistence over spectacle. Through self-education, Lincoln did not escape obscurity immediately. He remained poor, unknown, and physically burdened by labor. But something fundamental had shifted. He was no longer defined solely by circumstance. He carried within him a framework of thought that could not be taken away. This inner discipline became his true inheritance, more durable than land, more reliable than fortune. By the time he stepped forward into broader society, he did so not as an imitator of refinement, but as a practitioner of clarity. His education had not taught him how to appear learned. It had taught him how to think under pressure. And in a life that would repeatedly demand decisions made in uncertainty, this capacity would prove more valuable than any credential. As the fire burned low and the pages closed, Lincoln did not yet know where this discipline would lead. He knew only that words had given him leverage against limitation, and that law had offered him a vision of order amid chaos. These tools, forged quietly and without recognition, would soon be tested against the demands of ambition, failure, and public life. The discipline forged by books did not deliver immediate direction. Instead, it sharpened awareness of uncertainty. As Lincoln moved from adolescence into early adulthood, his life entered a restless phase marked not by clear ascent, but by experimentation, miscalculation, and repeated confrontation with limitation. Knowledge had widened his inner world, yet the outer world offered no obvious place for him to stand. He knew how to think, but not yet where to belong. His early ventures were practical attempts at stability rather than expressions of calling. He worked as a store clerk, then became a partner in a small business that promised independence and respectability. The promise collapsed quickly. The business failed, leaving him burdened with debt that would shadow him for years. This failure was not dramatic, but it was formative. It taught him that intelligence alone did not guarantee success, and that effort, however sincere, could still lead to collapse. Debt became a quiet companion, a constant reminder of misjudgment. He repaid it slowly, deliberately, refusing to escape responsibility even when escape was possible. This decision revealed something essential. He was not driven by speed, nor by the desire to erase mistakes. He was driven by an internal standard that demanded accountability, even when no one was watching. The failure did not embitter him, but it deepened his caution. During these years, his ambitions wandered without settling. He considered multiple paths, none of which felt inevitable. He tried surveying, tried commerce, tried local administration. Each role offered fragments of purpose, but no cohesive identity. This wandering was not indecision born of laziness. It was the discomfort of a man whose inner capacity had outgrown his external circumstances, yet had not found a structure large enough to contain it. Socially, he remained awkward and uncertain. His height made him conspicuous, his humor sometimes misjudged, his silences often misunderstood. He did not possess the easy confidence that attracts followers. Instead, he carried a seriousness that unsettled others, punctuated by sudden wit that revealed depth without resolving distance. He was present, yet not fully accessible, as though always measuring himself against something not yet visible. Politics entered his life not as destiny, but as curiosity. He observed local debates, attended gatherings, and tested his voice cautiously. His early political involvement lacked grandeur. He lost elections. He misread alliances. He underestimated opposition. These early defeats reinforced a pattern that would repeat throughout his life. Advancement came not through momentum, but through recovery. He did not rise by avoiding failure. He rose by absorbing it without retreat. Emotionally, this period was marked by instability. His melancholy, already familiar, deepened under the weight of uncertainty. He questioned his usefulness, his direction, and his capacity for lasting contribution. The gap between what he felt capable of and what he had achieved widened, creating a tension that pressed inward. This tension did not explode outward. It turned reflective, feeding his habit of self-examination. Relationships mirrored this instability. He formed attachments cautiously, often retreating when intimacy threatened to expose uncertainty. He feared becoming a burden, feared disappointing those who believed in him, feared discovering that his aspirations exceeded his abilities. These fears did not paralyze him, but they slowed him, forcing him to confront ambition without illusion. Yet, within this wandering lay an important maturation. Each failed venture refined his understanding of human systems. Business taught him the fragility of trust. Politics taught him the cost of public exposure. Debt taught him patience. Loss taught him humility. These lessons accumulated quietly, shaping a perspective that valued durability over brilliance. Greatness, during these years, did not appear to him as a clear destination. It appeared fragmented, scattered across experiences that did not yet cohere. He was not seeking power for its own sake. He was seeking alignment, a place where effort, ability, and purpose could meet without contradiction. That search, unresolved, kept him moving forward, even when direction felt absent. By the end of this restless youth, Lincoln had not achieved prominence. He had achieved something subtler. He had learned how failure felt, how responsibility weighed, and how uncertainty could be endured without surrender. He remained unsure where greatness might reside, but he had begun to understand what it would require. This understanding would soon collide with deeper emotional trials, testing whether endurance alone could carry him forward, or whether something within him would fracture under the strain. The search for purpose did not merely exhaust Lincoln's patience. It exposed the fault lines of his inner life. Ambition, when paired with conscience, proved heavier than uncertainty alone. As his 20s gave way to early adulthood, the strain of expectation collided with a temperament already inclined toward melancholy, producing a private darkness that no amount of discipline could fully restrain. This was not sadness as passing mood, but despair as condition, recurring and intimate, known to him as a familiar room he returned to against his will. Love entered this period not as rescue, but as risk. Lincoln longed for companionship, yet feared the obligations it imposed. He wanted closeness, yet recoiled from the permanence it demanded. When affection deepened, so did anxiety, as though commitment threatened to expose his instability rather than soothe it. He measured himself relentlessly, asking whether he could provide constancy when his own interior felt unsettled. The collapse came quietly, without spectacle. Friends noticed withdrawal, silence, and an intensity that tipped into paralysis. He struggled to sleep, struggled to act, struggled to believe that forward motion held meaning. At moments, those around him feared for his safety, recognizing that his despair had moved beyond introspection into something more dangerous. He was not courting attention, he was losing equilibrium. This emotional breakdown revealed the cost of his moral seriousness. Lincoln did not experience ambition as hunger for advancement alone. He experienced it as an obligation, a sense that if he rose, he must deserve it. This standard, self-imposed and unforgiving, allowed no shortcuts. Failure, under such a standard, felt not like misfortune, but like indictment. Each setback confirmed his harshest internal questions. Was he capable? Was he worthy? Was his striving itself a form of arrogance? Melancholy had always shadowed him, but now it pressed closer, narrowing his field of vision. The very traits that made him reflective became liabilities under its weight. Thought looped into rumination, caution hardened into hesitation. His intelligence, so useful in analysis, became relentless in self-critique. He could not escape his own mind, and his mind offered no refuge. Yet even here, something instructive occurred. Lincoln did not surrender to despair as identity. He acknowledged it as a condition. He allowed others to intervene, to watch, to worry, to help. This acceptance did not eliminate pain, but it prevented isolation from becoming terminal. He learned, painfully, that endurance sometimes required dependence, that strength could include admission of weakness. This period also clarified his emotional boundaries. He recognized that his inner darkness would never fully disappear, and that pretending otherwise would only deepen its power. Instead, he learned to coexist with it, to factor it into decisions rather than deny it. This accommodation did not weaken him, it refined him. He became more cautious with promises, more deliberate with commitments, and more empathetic toward unseen suffering. Ambition survived this collapse, but it changed character. It grew quieter, less performative, more inwardly regulated. He no longer chased advancement as proof of worth. He pursued it as responsibility, something to be earned slowly and exercised carefully. The cost of conscience had been revealed, and he resolved not to pay it blindly again. Love, too, returned altered. Relationships would remain complex, marked by negotiation between closeness and self-preservation. He would continue to fear the harm his instability might cause others. Yet, he would no longer retreat entirely. This balance, imperfect and ongoing, mirrored the broader pattern of his life. Progress would come not through resolution, but through management of contradiction. The private darkness did not end here. It receded, then returned, then receded again across decades. But this first collapse marked a turning point. Lincoln emerged not cured, but calibrated. He understood the limits of his endurance and the dangers of isolation. He learned that moral ambition exacted psychological toll, and that ignoring that toll risked destruction rather than greatness. As he steadied himself and returned to public life, he did so carrying this knowledge quietly. He did not speak of it often. He did not dramatize it, but it shaped his judgment, his pacing, and his capacity to sit with pain without rushing to escape it. The man who would later absorb national grief without theatrical despair first learned here how close the edge could feel and how essential it was to step back from it without denying its existence. When Lincoln returned to the world after his private collapse, he did not seek reinvention through spectacle. He chose instead a discipline that demanded clarity, patience, and restraint, and that punished excess as surely as it punished ignorance. The law offered him this discipline, not as abstraction, but as lived practice, carried across dusty roads and improvised courtrooms scattered through the prairie. Here, amid juries of farmers and judges of uneven temperament, he learned how persuasion actually worked. The prairie circuit was not glamorous. It required weeks of travel by horse or foot, nights spent in cramped inns, and days consumed by disputes that rarely touched grand principle. Yet it was precisely this ordinariness that trained him. Each case forced him to translate complexity into language ordinary people could trust. There was no room for ornament. There was only truth as it could be made intelligible. Lincoln discovered early that the law rewarded restraint more than aggression. Loudness alienated juries. Cleverness without clarity bred suspicion. He learned to slow his speech, to pause deliberately, and to let silence do part of the work. When he spoke plainly, arranging facts carefully and allowing logic to reveal itself step by step. This method did not overwhelm, it invited. Persuasion, he realized, was not domination. It was an alignment. It required understanding how others saw the world before asking them to see differently. This insight shaped his courtroom presence. He listened intently, not only to testimony, but to tone, hesitation, and contradiction. He read people as carefully as statutes, aware that human judgment rarely followed strict logic alone. The circuit also exposed him to the full range of human conflict. He defended the guilty and the innocent, represented creditors and debtors, navigated feuds rooted in pride as much as principle. These encounters reinforced his belief that morality could not be reduced to categories. Circumstance mattered, intention mattered, consequence mattered. The law, when applied without empathy, risked becoming cruel by procedure. His reputation grew not through intimidation, but through trust. Judges respected his preparation. Opponents respected his fairness. Clients respected his honesty. Even when it cost him advantage, he did not promise victory. He promised effort. This reliability became his quiet distinction in a profession often marked by exaggeration. Language remained central. Lincoln refined his sentences until they carried only what was necessary. He learned to use metaphor sparingly, deploying it not for beauty, but for comprehension. A well-chosen image could clarify what abstract reasoning obscured. In this, he discovered the moral power of plain speech. It did not manipulate emotion. It respected intelligence. These years also disciplined his temperament. Courtrooms demanded emotional control. Anger weakened the argument. Impatience betrayed insecurity. Lincoln learned to regulate himself under scrutiny, to absorb provocation without reacting, and to maintain composure when outcomes disappointed. This emotional restraint did not diminish feeling, it directed it. The prairie lawyer's life grounded him socially. He moved among people who measured worth by reliability rather than refinement. His background no longer isolated him, it connected him. He understood their concerns because he shared their vocabulary. This shared ground would later allow him to speak to a divided nation without condescension. Law did not elevate him instantly, it steadied him. It gave structure to ambition and channel to intellect. It transformed his private discipline into public practice. Through repetition, failure, and incremental success, he became something rare. A man whose authority rested not on force or flair, but on credibility. By the time he emerged from the circuit years, Lincoln carried with him more than legal skill. He carried a philosophy of persuasion rooted in respect, patience, and moral clarity. These lessons, learned far from centers of power, would later shape decisions made under far greater pressure. The prairie had taught him how to speak so that others would listen, and how to listen so that speaking mattered. Politics entered Lincoln's life the way most enduring forces did for him, not as revelation, but as pressure. It grew gradually from observation, from arguments overheard in taverns and courtrooms, from laws applied unevenly across human lives. At first, his involvement was cautious, almost procedural. He believed in order, improvement, and stability. He trusted institutions more than movements, process more than passion. Yet beneath this measured exterior, a contradiction was forming that would not remain dormant. Slavery was not new to him. He had encountered it early, not as theory, but as fact, visible in the geography of the nation and the logic of its economy. He had seen enslaved people transported south, had heard justifications offered casually, almost lazily, by those who benefited. For years, he held these observations without public confrontation. Uneasy but restrained, he understood that outrage alone did not change systems, and that premature moral certainty could isolate rather than persuade. Early political service reflected this restraint. He spoke of infrastructure, development, and opportunity. He argued for roads, canals, and education, believing that material progress could soften social division. These positions were pragmatic and forward-looking, yet they circled the deeper question without addressing it. Slavery remained present but unnamed, an unresolved contradiction embedded in a nation that claimed liberty while practicing exclusion. Over time, avoidance became impossible. As debates over expansion intensified, slavery ceased to be a regional issue and became a national reckoning. New territories forced the question forward. Would the nation allow the institution to grow, or would it contain it? Could a republic tolerate moral compromise indefinitely without losing coherence? Lincoln felt the pressure of these questions not only politically, but personally. His conscience, long disciplined, began to assert itself with greater insistence. His awakening was not explosive. It was incremental, shaped by legal reasoning and moral reflection rather than ideological fervor. He framed slavery as fundamentally incompatible with the principles the nation professed, not because it offended sentiment, but because it undermined logic, a system that declared all men equal while denying that equality in practice was not merely unjust, It was unstable. Contradiction, he believed, could not sustain itself forever. This realization reshaped his public voice. He did not call for immediate upheaval. He called for consistency. He argued that a nation must align its actions with its declarations or accept the erosion of both. This approach distinguished him from more radical voices while placing him firmly at odds with defenders of the status quo. He was not seeking moral purity. He was seeking coherence. The cost of this stance was immediate. Friends cautioned restraint. Allies worried about alienating voters. Opponents seized upon his words as evidence of extremism. Yet Lincoln persisted, not because the position was safe, but because retreat now felt dishonest. His years of legal training had taught him that unresolved contradictions eventually surface, often violently. Better, he believed, to confront them deliberately than to pretend they did not exist. This period marked a transformation in his political identity. He ceased to be merely a participant in governance and became a figure defined by moral tension. Slavery was no longer one issue among many. It became the lens through which all other questions were refracted. Economic policy, territorial expansion, and national unity all now hinged on whether the nation would tolerate contradiction or demand resolution. His rhetoric reflected this shift. He spoke more deliberately, weighing each word for consequence. He avoided demonization, choosing instead to expose inconsistency. He did not accuse individuals of evil. He questioned systems of justification. This method did not inflame crowds, but it unsettled them. It forced listeners to confront uncomfortable logic without offering emotional escape. Internally, the awakening was equally demanding. Lincoln understood that opposing slavery's expansion placed him on a collision course with powerful interests. He accepted that advancement might slow, that defeat might follow. Yet he also recognized that ambition divorced from conscience was hollow. The cost of silence had become greater than the cost of opposition. This moral clarification did not resolve his melancholy. If anything, it deepened it. To see a contradiction clearly is to feel its weight. He carried the knowledge that the nation he sought to serve was built upon compromise that could not endure. This awareness sharpened his seriousness and tempered his optimism. He no longer believed progress was inevitable. He believed it required sustained effort under conditions of resistance. By the end of this phase, Lincoln's public life had acquired a defining axis. Slavery, as an unresolved contradiction, had begun to shape his trajectory. He was no longer navigating politics as a series of opportunities. He was navigating it as a moral landscape, uneven and hazardous. The man who once wandered in search of purpose now found himself anchored by a question that would not release him. How could a nation dedicated to liberty justify bondage, and what must be risked to force an answer? This question did not yet elevate him. It exposed him. It made him vulnerable to defeat and misunderstanding. But it also aligned his inner discipline with his public action, creating a coherence that would carry him forward into trials far greater than those he had yet faced. Defeat arrived without drama, but it lingered with persistence. Lincoln had learned to expect hardship. Yet, electoral loss carried a different weight because it was public, recorded, and interpreted by others as judgment. When he failed to secure higher office, the rejection did not erupt into anger or retreat. it settled quietly, forcing him to confront the distance between moral conviction and popular acceptance. The loss humbled him, but it did not erase direction. Instead, it slowed him, compelling patience where impulse might have pushed forward too quickly. He had spoken with care, argued with logic, and appealed to coherence rather than passion. Still, the result was failure. Voters chose familiarity, compromise, or reassurance over unresolved questions. For Lincoln, this outcome clarified something essential. Truth, even when carefully presented, did not guarantee assent. Persuasion required time, repetition, and an audience prepared to listen. This realization did not weaken his belief. It disciplined his expectations. Public defeat stripped away illusion. It revealed the limits of influence without preparation, the danger of assuming readiness where fear still dominated. He recognized that moral clarity, offered prematurely, could provoke resistance rather than reflection. This was not a call to silence, but to strategy. He began to understand that timing mattered as much as substance, and that patience was not passivity, but design. The loss also exposed him to ridicule. Opponents framed the result as evidence of irrelevance. Allies urged caution, suggesting retreat into law and private success. The temptation to withdraw was real. He had tasted public rejection and understood its cost. Yet withdrawal felt incomplete, as though abandoning the question that now defined him would hollow out everything he had learned. Instead, he returned to his work with renewed discipline. Law became not an escape, but a laboratory. He continued to refine language, sharpen logic, and observe human judgment under pressure. Each case offered insight into persuasion's mechanics, reinforcing lessons politics had delivered harshly. He watched how people responded to fairness, how credibility accumulated slowly, and how consistency outlasted charisma. Privately, the defeat deepened his introspection. He examined not only what he had said, but how he had been heard. He questioned whether his tone invited understanding or merely compliance. This self-critique did not devolve into self-loathing. It became methodical, almost clinical. He treated failure as data, something to be studied rather than lamented. This period also strengthened his resilience. He learned that momentum could be rebuilt without applause, that progress did not require immediate validation. The loss inoculated him against future rejection, teaching him to separate outcome from worth. This separation would later prove essential, allowing him to endure criticism without abandoning course. Patience, once learned through labor and law, now matured through disappointment. He resisted the urge to re-enter politics prematurely, understanding that readiness was mutual. The nation, as much as the man, required preparation. He waited not because he lacked ambition, but because ambition without alignment risked waste. Resolve sharpened quietly. His convictions did not soften. If anything, they became more precise. He refined arguments, clarified principles, and stripped away rhetorical excess. The defeat forced him to articulate his position not as reaction, but as foundation. Slavery remained the unresolved contradiction, but now he understood that exposing it required more than declaration. It required endurance. The refusal of defeat to define him marked a turning point. He did not romanticize loss, nor did he resent those who delivered it. He accepted it as instruction. In doing so, he transformed humiliation into preparation. The electoral setback did not close a chapter. It calibrated the pace of the next one. By the time he reemerged, Lincoln was quieter, steadier, and more deliberate. The man shaped by firelight and prairie now carried the additional weight of public refusal. He had learned that progress rarely moves in straight lines, and that setbacks often serve as training rather than termination. Defeat, once absorbed, became an ally rather than an adversary. This refusal to be extinguished did not announce itself. It waited, gathering strength beneath the surface. When opportunity returned, it would find him prepared not by confidence, but by patience, and guided not by urgency, but by resolve that had learned how to survive disappointment without surrendering purpose. The patience forged in defeat did not remain idle for long. When Lincoln stepped back into public view, it was not with the confidence of inevitability, but with the steadiness of preparation. The national conversation had shifted, tightening around the same unresolved contradiction that had haunted him for years. Slavery, once treated as a distant compromise, now demanded definition. Into this tension stepped a rival whose clarity was tactical rather than moral, and whose popularity tested whether the nation preferred comfort over coherence. The debates with Douglas were not merely political events. They were public examinations of national conscience, staged repeatedly before crowds who sensed that something larger than a Senate seat was at stake. Lincoln understood this instinctively. He did not enter these debates to dominate an opponent. He entered to expose a choice. His words were shaped not to humiliate, but to clarify, not to inflame, but to illuminate. Douglas argued for flexibility, for letting each territory decide its own course. The language was appealing, cloaked in the rhetoric of freedom and self-determination. Lincoln recognized the danger immediately. Choice, when severed from principle, became disguise. He framed the argument not as North against South, but as consistency against contradiction. A nation, he insisted, could not indefinitely affirm equality while tolerating inequality. This was not moral outrage, it was logical pressure. His delivery reflected years of restraint. He spoke slowly, allowing listeners to follow the reasoning rather than react to emotion. He repeated ideas with variation, reinforcing understanding without redundancy. He used metaphors sparingly, choosing images that grounded abstraction in shared experience. Each sentence was built to endure scrutiny, to remain intact when separated from applause. What transformed these debates was not victory in the conventional sense. Lincoln did not win the seat, yet something more consequential occurred. His words traveled beyond the immediate audience, carried by newspapers and conversation into regions that had never heard him speak. People encountered not a demagogue, but a thinker willing to wrestle publicly with contradiction. He did not promise easy solutions. He demanded reckoning. This exposure altered his public identity. He ceased to be a regional figure and became a national presence, not because he claimed authority, but because he articulated a question others felt, but had not yet voiced. His moral seriousness, once a liability, became a distinction. In a climate of evasion, his refusal to obscure meaning stood out. The debates also tested him personally. Standing repeatedly before skeptical crowds required stamina and control. He absorbed hostility without retaliation, misunderstanding without bitterness. Each encounter reinforced his belief that persuasion required dignity as much as argument. He modeled the restraint he advocated, proving that conviction did not require cruelty. In these moments, Lincoln's inner discipline aligned fully with his public voice. The boy who read by firelight, the lawyer who practiced clarity, and the politician tempered by defeat converged. He spoke not as a reformer intoxicated by certainty, but as a citizen burdened by responsibility. This tone resonated precisely because it avoided excess. Though the immediate outcome disappointed, the long-term effect was undeniable. The nation had heard him. His words had entered the bloodstream of public thought, shaping how the crisis was discussed. He had become, almost despite himself, a moral reference point. Others would argue policy. Lincoln had framed principle. As the debates concluded, he returned once more to private life, aware that something irreversible had occurred. He had spoken plainly about contradiction, and the nation could not unhear it. The road ahead remained uncertain, but the man walking it now carried a different weight. He was no longer merely responding to events. He was helping define their meaning. This transformation did not bring peace. It brought visibility, expectation, and heightened risk. Yet, Lincoln accepted these without celebration. He understood that moral clarity, once offered, demanded consistency. The debates had shaped a nation's conversation, and in doing so, they had reshaped the man who led them, preparing him for a role neither he nor the country could yet fully imagine. The road to the presidency did not open before Lincoln like a cleared path. It assembled itself unevenly, through fracture rather than consensus, through calculation tempered by chance, and through a national mood increasingly defined by anxiety rather than confidence. What elevated him was not inevitability, but alignment between a divided moment and a man shaped by division. He did not rise because the country agreed with him. He rose because it could not agree with itself. The political landscape had hardened. Parties fractured along lines they could no longer pretend were merely procedural. Old coalitions dissolved under the pressure of the same unresolved contradiction Lincoln had insisted could not be contained forever. As the ground shifted, many familiar figures stumbled, bound to compromises that now felt evasive. Lincoln, by contrast, stood slightly apart, not because he was extreme, but because he had been consistent. In a season of improvisation, consistency became an unexpected asset. His nomination emerged from calculation as much as conviction. Party leaders weighed electability, geography, and tone. They feared radicalism and distrusted complacency. Lincoln appeared, at first glance, almost transitional, a figure firm enough to draw a line, yet restrained enough to avoid immediate rupture. This perception was incomplete, but it worked in his favor. He was underestimated in ways that granted him space. Chance played its role as well. Rivals divided support. Timing favored patience. Words spoken years earlier, once dismissed, resurfaced with new relevance. Lincoln did not control these forces. He navigated them. He accepted advantage without arrogance, aware that fortune could reverse as quickly as it had arrived. This awareness kept him measured when celebration might have invited recklessness. The campaign itself unfolded amid rising tension. Every statement was passed for threat, every silence interpreted as strategy. Lincoln maintained a disciplined ambiguity, not from deceit, but from recognition that clarity without power could provoke catastrophe without preventing it. He spoke enough to anchor principle, but not so much as to ignite panic. This balance drew criticism from all sides. Yet, it preserved a fragile coalition long enough to carry him forward. Victory did not bring unity. It brought fractures into the open. The election result confirmed what had already become true. The nation could no longer contain its contradictions through process alone. Secession followed swiftly, not as a reaction, but as culmination. Lincoln assumed the presidency not at the threshold of governance, but at the brink of collapse. The office he inherited was intact in form and shattered in substance. In this moment, the full weight of his preparation became visible. He did not mistake the office for power. He understood that authority required legitimacy, and legitimacy required patience under provocation. He resisted premature gestures of force, choosing instead to hold ground while the meaning of the crisis clarified itself. This restraint frustrated those who demanded immediacy, yet it prevented escalation before purpose was defined. The edge of catastrophe sharpened his focus. He recognized that every action would be read symbolically. That tone could matter as much as policy. His language softened even as stakes rose. He appealed to memory, to shared identity, to bonds older than the present conflict. He did not beg. He reasoned. He did not threaten. He invited reflection. These choices did not avert conflict, but they framed it. Behind the public composure, the burden intensified. The presidency exposed him to a scale of consequence he had only imagined. Decisions now carried national weight, and delay itself became a choice with cost. Yet, the habits forged through hardship served him. He measured, revisited, and absorbed counsel without surrendering judgment. He accepted responsibility without theatrics, aware that gravity did not require performance. This unexpected elevation tested his philosophy of leadership. He had believed in persuasion, restraint, and coherence. Now he faced a reality where persuasion had limits, restraint risked misinterpretation, and coherence demanded defense. The tools remained the same, but the pressure magnified. He would soon discover how they held under strain. As inauguration approached, the nation hovered between speech and silence, between compromise and conflict. Lincoln stood at the center, not as conqueror, but as custodian, tasked with preserving a structure already cracking. The road that brought him here had been indirect, shaped by loss, discipline, and defeat. It had prepared him not to command admiration, but to endure responsibility. This was the threshold. Chance had opened the door. Calculation had carried him through. Fracture had elevated him. What followed would determine whether preparation could meet catastrophe, and whether a man shaped by patience could guide a nation through the violence of its own contradictions. The fracture did not announce itself with a single blow. It spread, deliberate and methodical, as states chose departure over uncertainty, separation over submission. Lincoln entered the presidency with the Union already unraveling, the authority of his office intact in name yet hollow in reach. Flags changed, arsenals shifted, and loyalty became a question rather than an assumption. He was sworn in not as a unifier restored, but as a custodian under siege. Secession forced him into command before command was fully defined. He inherited an army scattered and small, a government divided in sympathy, and a public uncertain whether restraint signaled wisdom or weakness. His authority was incomplete, constrained by law, opinion, and the very principles he sought to preserve. To act too aggressively risked legitimizing rebellion as defense. To act too cautiously risked dissolving what remained of national resolve. Every option carried consequence, and delay itself became a decision with irreversible cost. Doubt surrounded him, loud and persistent. Critics accused him of indecision. Allies demanded firmness. Rivals measured his every word for opportunity. Yet Lincoln understood that the war, if it came, must be framed not as conquest but as preservation. The Union could not be saved by force alone. It had to be defended in meaning. This conviction guided his early posture. He spoke of law, obligation, and continuity, insisting that rebellion did not create legality simply by declaring it. When violence finally broke into the open, it did so at the margins, where symbols mattered as much as strategy. The first shots were not merely military actions, they were declarations of intent. Lincoln absorbed them without theatrical response, recognizing that escalation required legitimacy. He called the nation to defend itself, not to punish its own. This language mattered. It positioned the conflict as a tragic necessity rather than moral crusade, preserving space for loyalty among those still undecided. Command tested him immediately. Generals hesitated or failed. Information arrived fragmented and late. Political pressure competed with military judgment. Lincoln, lacking formal training, compensated through study, questioning, and relentless attention. He learned maps, timetables, and logistics with the same discipline he had once applied to law. He listened, then decided, aware that delegation did not absolve responsibility. Chaos defined these early months. The capital felt vulnerable, surrounded by uncertainty. Rumors outpaced fact. Confidence eroded quickly after early defeats. Lincoln absorbed each setback publicly and processed it privately, refusing to displace blame while quietly recalibrating strategy. He did not equate command with certainty. He equated it with accountability. Incomplete authority forced innovation. He stretched constitutional boundaries cautiously, convinced that survival sometimes demanded temporary strain. Each decision was weighed against precedent and consequence. He did not claim perfection. He claimed necessity. This distinction mattered to him deeply, anchoring action within conscience even as circumstances eroded clarity. War transformed his days into a rhythm of dispatches and decisions, nights into intervals of calculation and doubt. The weight was visible. He aged quickly, shoulders stooped under responsibility. Yet within this pressure, something steadied. The uncertainty that once haunted him privately now mirrored the nation's condition. He understood this terrain. He had lived within contradiction before. Now he lived within it publicly. As the Union fractured and war became reality, Lincoln emerged not as a general of certainty, but as a leader of endurance. He did not promise swift victory. He promised persistence. The authority he lacked in force, he compensated for in resolve. The chaos that surrounded him did not erase his discipline. It tested it. The war had begun, and with it, the long trial of whether patience could survive violence, whether restraint could coexist with command, and whether a man shaped by doubt could carry a nation through bloodshed without surrendering the principles that made survival meaningful. War did not yield to intention. It resisted clarity, punished impatience, and exposed the cost of illusion. Lincoln learned to command not through triumph, but through failure, and the lessons arrived faster than comfort allowed. Early campaigns promised resolution and delivered humiliation. Plans dissolved under friction, and confidence collapsed into confusion. Each defeat narrowed his options while widening his understanding of what command actually demanded. He had entered the war believing that purpose could substitute for preparation, that loyalty might compensate for experience. Reality dismantled these assumptions methodically. Armies moved slowly, coordination failed, and courage proved insufficient against logistics and leadership. Lincoln absorbed these failures without deflection. He read reports late into the night, traced movements on maps, and interrogated assumptions that had once seemed reasonable. He did not condemn complexity. He learned to live inside it. Strategy emerged as patience refined by pressure. He began to see that timing mattered as much as force, that victories won too early or pursued too aggressively could unravel gains elsewhere. The war was not a single contest, but a system of interlocking constraints. To push one front without securing another invited collapse. This understanding did not come naturally. It was learned through the slow accumulation of consequences. Restraint became a burden rather than a preference. Every delay was interpreted as weakness, every measured decision as hesitation. Lincoln carried the weight of public impatience without allowing it to dictate action. He resisted the temptation to replace generals impulsively, knowing that instability bred uncertainty. When replacements came, they came with deliberation, informed by patterns rather than pressure. He also learned the human cost of command. Casualty lists transformed from abstractions into familiar numbers, then into faces and names. Each loss pressed against his conscience, sharpening his resolve to avoid waste. He rejected glory, purchased cheaply with blood. This rejection was not passive. It demanded courage of a different kind. To wait when waiting meant accusation required endurance as severe as any battlefield test. Military failure taught him humility without paralysis. He sought counsel widely, questioned aggressively, and accepted correction without defensiveness. He did not pretend expertise he lacked. Instead, he cultivated judgment, the capacity to weigh imperfect options under constraint. This judgment became his defining military skill, compensating for technical gaps with strategic coherence. The burden of restraint also extended to purpose. As the war deepened, its meaning threatened to blur. Was it merely a struggle for territory or something more fundamental? Lincoln recognized that without moral direction, strategy risked becoming a mechanism. Yet he understood that moral clarity, imposed prematurely, could fracture support. Timing again asserted itself. He waited for conditions that would allow principle to reinforce, rather than undermine, military necessity. Each failure recalibrated him. He learned when to push and when to hold, when to intervene and when to observe. He learned that leadership required absorbing blame to preserve focus. He learned that command was not dominance but persistence under scrutiny. These lessons did not ease the war, they made it survivable. As months passed, a pattern formed. The nation's endurance mirrored his own. Both were learning under pressure, shedding illusion, and paying for knowledge with loss. Lincoln's authority, once incomplete, solidified not through force, but through consistency. He became a steady presence amid fluctuation, a center that did not promise relief, but offered direction. The war continued, unresolved and relentless. Yet Lincoln emerged and changed. He had learned to command not by mastering violence, but by mastering restraint. Strategy, timing, and patience became his instruments. Failure had been his instructor, and he had learned its lessons without surrendering purpose. The burden remained heavy, but it was now carried with intention rather than uncertainty, preparing him for the moment when restraint itself would become the most consequential decision of all. The war had taught Lincoln how to wait, but it had also taught him that waiting carried its own cost. By the time emancipation entered his private calculations, the conflict had already stripped away earlier illusions. Preservation alone no longer explained the suffering. Territory changed hands, armies maneuvered, yet the core contradiction remained untouched. The nation bled to maintain a structure that still denied its own logic. Lincoln understood that strategy without meaning would exhaust both will and legitimacy. The war needed a purpose that could endure loss. Emancipation emerged not as moral release, but as moral gamble. To declare freedom was to alter the war's foundation, transforming it from a struggle over union into a reckoning over justice. The risk was immense. Allies might fracture, border states could defect, foreign powers might intervene. Soldiers might resist fighting for a cause they had not enlisted to serve. Lincoln weighed these dangers relentlessly, not out of cowardice, but out of responsibility. He understood that moral action, if mistimed, could destroy the very conditions required to sustain it. He framed the decision as necessity rather than idealism. Slavery, he concluded, was not merely a moral wrong. It was a strategic vulnerability. It sustained the enemy's economy, stabilized its labor, and clarified its purpose. To leave it intact was to fight with one hand bound. Yet, even this calculation did not simplify the choice. Weaponizing freedom risked corrupting it, turning principle into instrument. Lincoln struggled with this tension, knowing that using morality for advantage could cheapen it, if not grounded in sincerity. Timing again proved decisive. He waited for a moment when declaration would follow strength rather than desperation. A partial victory provided that opening, allowing emancipation to appear as assertion rather than plea. When the proclamation came, it was measured, legalistic, and limited. It did not free all enslaved people. It did not resolve injustice. It redefined the war's trajectory. The restraint embedded in its language reflected his understanding of consequence. This was not redemption. It was direction. The reaction was immediate and polarized. Some celebrated it as overdue justice. Others condemned it as betrayal. Lincoln absorbed both responses without illusion. He knew the proclamation would not be judged by intent alone, but by endurance. Freedom declared but undefended would become cruelty by promise. From this moment forward, victory would carry a different obligation. The war could no longer end as it had begun. Privately, the burden deepened. Lincoln recognized that he had crossed a threshold that could not be reversed. He had bound the nation's survival to its conscience, ensuring that compromise would now require surrender of meaning. This was the gamble. If the Union lost, emancipation would be remembered as reckless provocation. If it won, freedom would be claimed as inevitability rather than risk. He accepted this asymmetry without complaint. Emancipation also reshaped command. The army now carried a moral dimension that complicated discipline and strategy. Enslaved people fled toward Union lines, forcing decisions about protection, labor, and recognition. Lincoln insisted that these human beings not be returned to bondage, anchoring principle even as logistics strained. He understood that inconsistency here would hollow the declaration's credibility. The meaning of sacrifice shifted as well. Death on the battlefield now served a cause that reached beyond territorial integrity. This did not reduce grief, but it reframed it. Lincoln's language reflected this change, moving slowly toward a vocabulary of purpose rather than preservation. He spoke less of restoring what had been and more of redefining what could be. This evolution was careful, aware that moral transformation required public readiness. Emancipation did not end debate, it intensified it. The nation was forced to confront the war's stakes without abstraction. Neutrality became harder to maintain. Silence became interpretation. Lincoln accepted the narrowing of options as the price of coherence. He believed that clarity, once established, could sustain effort even when outcome remained uncertain. The gamble altered his own self-understanding. He no longer saw himself merely as guardian of a constitutional order. He became custodian of a moral direction that would outlast his authority. This awareness sharpened his humility. He did not claim authorship of freedom. He claimed responsibility for its defense. As the war pressed on, emancipation stood as both promise and challenge. It offered meaning, but demanded resolve. It expanded the conflict's horizon, ensuring that victory would require more than battlefield success. Lincoln had bound the nation's fate to a principle it could not fully control. The gamble had been made. From this point forward, the war would be measured not only by survival, but by whether freedom, once declared, could be sustained under fire. Even as the war expanded in scope and meaning, Lincoln's private world contracted under the weight of loss. Public resolve did not insulate him from personal grief. It intensified it. The White House, crowded with petitioners, generals, and politicians, also became a place of mourning, where absence echoed more loudly than ceremony. In the midst of national crisis, family tragedy struck with intimate force, exposing the limits of authority and the universality of pain. The death of his son did not arrive as a lesson or symbol. It arrived as a rupture, a child's illness, the slow vigil, the final quiet. These experiences stripped Lincoln of the distance he maintained elsewhere. He was no longer a president balancing factions. He was a father confronting helplessness. Grief collapsed hierarchy. Titles meant nothing in that room. Power offered no remedy. Loss was absolute and unnegotiable. This sorrow did not break him publicly, but it altered him permanently. His melancholy, long familiar, deepened into something steadier and more encompassing. He moved through days with heavier steps, his face etched by fatigue and remembrance. Yet, he did not withdraw. Instead, Grief expanded his empathy outward. The letters from bereaved parents no longer represented abstract sacrifice. They mirrored his own experience. He answered them with care, not as obligation, but as recognition. This private suffering sharpened his moral clarity. Death clarified proportion. Arguments that once seemed urgent now appeared trivial beside the permanence of loss. Decisions acquired gravity not from politics, but from consequence measured in human terms. Lincoln became more deliberate, less tolerant of waste, more resistant to posturing. He understood that every order carried potential grief, and this understanding disciplined his authority. The contrast between public role and private pain intensified his introspection. He questioned not only strategy, but meaning. What justified continued sacrifice? What kind of peace could honor the dead without sanctifying violence? These questions did not lead him to despair. They refined his purpose. He came to believe that suffering demanded coherence, that loss unanchored to principle was cruelty rather than tragedy. Publicly, he did not display his grief theatrically. He spoke with restraint, allowing silence to carry weight where rhetoric might fail. This restraint did not signal indifference. It conveyed seriousness. Those around him sensed the depth beneath the composure. It lent his words credibility, grounding policy in lived understanding rather than abstraction. Family loss also recalibrated his view of reconciliation. He resisted calls for vengeance, recognizing how easily pain could harden into perpetuation. His own grief did not seek retaliation, it sought meaning. This orientation shaped his vision for the nation's future. Justice, he believed, must restore rather than replicate suffering. Mercy was not weakness. It was acknowledgement of shared humanity. In this period, Lincoln's leadership matured into something quieter and more formidable. He no longer needed affirmation. He had measured ambition against mortality and found restraint more durable. The public saw resolve. Those closest to him saw endurance. Both were true. His capacity to hold grief without surrendering function became a model for a nation asked to do the same. As the war ground on, the boundary between private pain and public duty blurred. Each reinforced the other. Loss deepened empathy. Empathy clarified purpose. Lincoln carried his sorrow not as a burden to be shed, but as a lens through which decisions gained meaning. The man who had once struggled with inner darkness now allowed grief to inform rather than immobilize him. This synthesis did not soften the war's demands. It sharpened them. He became less willing to compromise on principles that honored sacrifice, and more willing to compromise on pride. The balance was delicate, sustained by humility and resolve in equal measure. In the shadow of personal loss, Lincoln's leadership acquired moral depth that no strategy alone could provide. He had learned that command without empathy was brittle, and empathy without resolve was insufficient. Holding both became his defining task. The nation watched a leader who did not escape grief, but carried it forward, transforming private sorrow into public steadiness, and ensuring that the meaning of sacrifice remained central as the war approached its most decisive phase. The battlefield at Gettysburg did not resemble triumph. It was quiet in a way that felt provisional, as though the ground itself was holding its breath. The fighting had ended, but the cost lingered everywhere, etched into torn earth and improvised graves. Lincoln arrived not as a conqueror, presiding over victory, but as a witness summoned by consequence. The ceremony was meant to dedicate ground. What it became was a redefinition of meaning. He understood the danger of the moment immediately. Excess would trivialize sacrifice. Precision could honor it. The nation had already endured speeches swollen with certainty, words piled high to cover grief. Lincoln chose the opposite. He chose restraint so severe it bordered on disappearance. Few sentences, carefully balanced, would carry what volumes could not. This choice was not stylistic modesty, it was moral calculation. When he spoke, he anchored the present to the past without glorifying either. He invoked origin not to claim purity, but to establish obligation. The nation had been conceived in an ideal it had not yet fulfilled. The war, he suggested, was the test of whether that ideal could survive contradiction. This framing transformed loss into examination. Sacrifice became evidence, not spectacle. The language did not command feeling. It guided reflection. He did not enumerate horrors. He trusted listeners to feel them. He did not assign blame. He was assigned responsibility. The fallen were not instruments of policy. They were participants in a trial larger than any single cause. Their deaths demanded coherence from the living. Memory, in his hands, became active rather than static. He resisted the temptation to declare meaning complete. Instead, he cast remembrance as obligation, something that required continued effort. The ground was dedicated not by words alone, but by what would follow. This shift moved the audience from mourning toward purpose without erasing grief. The speech's power lay in what it refused. It refused triumphalism. It refused finality. It refused to claim that suffering had already been redeemed. In doing so, it preserved dignity. The nation was not absolved by victory. It was bound by sacrifice. This binding altered how the war was understood, placing moral endurance above military outcome. For Lincoln, the moment crystallized years of discipline. The boy who learned clarity by firelight, the lawyer who trusted plain speech, the leader tempered by loss, all converged. He spoke as someone who had measured words against consequence and found that fewer could carry more. The speech did not elevate him above the dead. It placed him among the living who must justify survival. Reaction was subdued at first. Some dismissed the remarks as insufficient. Others sensed something harder to articulate. Over time, the words settled, not through repetition alone, but through resonance. They offered a vocabulary equal to grief without exploiting it. They gave the nation a way to speak about sacrifice without surrendering to despair or vengeance. National purpose, reshaped here, became forward-looking without denial. The war was no longer merely to restore what had been, but to complete what had been promised. This reframing did not simplify conflict. It clarified stakes. Ending the war would require not just defeat of armies, but commitment to meaning. Lincoln left Gettysburg aware that language had done what force alone could not. It had aligned memory with obligation. It had honored the dead without imprisoning the living in sorrow. In choosing restraint, he had given the nation a compass rather than a banner. As the conflict continued, those few words traveled with the army and the public alike, a quiet measure against which actions would be judged. They did not end suffering. They defined why endurance mattered, and in doing so, they prepared the ground for the final, brutal phase of the war, where resolve would be tested not only by violence, but by the temptation to forget why the cost had been paid at all. The war did not crescendo toward resolution. It ground forward, uneven and exhausting, eroding certainty as steadily as it eroded strength. After Gettysburg, victory appeared imaginable but not imminent, visible on the horizon, yet unreachable by direct path. Lincoln lived within this tension daily, holding progress in one hand and doubt in the other, aware that either could slip without warning. Success came in increments too small to celebrate, and losses too large to ignore. Exhaustion became structural. The machinery of war demanded constant attention, and the cost of inattention grew sharper with every month. Lincoln's days were consumed by dispatches that arrived incomplete and contradictory, by meetings that offered urgency without clarity, and by decisions that carried moral weight disproportionate to their immediate effect. Sleep shortened, humor thinned. The toll marked his face and posture, aging him faster than years alone could explain. Relentlessness tested conviction. Each advance provoked a counterattack. Each victory revealed new demands. The war's logic resisted closure, insisting that preservation of purpose required renewed sacrifice. Lincoln felt the pressure of accumulated loss pressing against his belief that meaning could justify endurance. He did not romanticize suffering. He questioned it constantly, asking whether the line between necessary persistence and unnecessary prolongation had begun to blur. Doubt became a companion rather than an enemy. He learned to consult it without surrendering to it. Doubt forced reconsideration of strategy, reassessment of leadership, and recalibration of expectation. It prevented complacency, yet it also carried risk. Too much doubt could paralyze action. Lincoln's discipline lay in holding doubt close without allowing it to govern. The moral weight intensified as emancipation unfolded unevenly. Freedom advanced alongside violence, hope alongside reprisal. The contradiction he had named years earlier now manifested in lived complexity. Liberation did not arrive cleanly. It arrived contested, fragile, and incomplete. Lincoln understood that moral progress rarely matched moral aspiration. This gap weighed on him, sharpening his resolve while complicating satisfaction. Public pressure did not relent. Critics accused him of prolonging suffering. Supporters demanded acceleration. Soldiers demanded relief. Families demanded explanation. Lincoln absorbed these demands without pretending they aligned. He resisted the urge to promise what could not be delivered, choosing honesty over reassurance. This choice preserved trust, even as it intensified loneliness. Leadership required endurance without relief. He learned to accept that affirmation would be intermittent and criticism constant. The role offered no refuge from consequence. Each decision created new obligations, and success only expanded responsibility. He did not seek escape. He sought coherence, believing that persistence, guided by purpose, could outlast exhaustion, guided by impulse. As the war inched forward, Lincoln's vision narrowed and clarified. He became less interested in tactical elegance and more focused on cumulative effect. He valued generals who understood attrition, logistics, and sustained pressure over dramatic maneuver. This preference reflected his own temperament. He believed wars, like moral transformations, were rarely won by brilliance alone. They were won by endurance aligned with direction. The accumulation of moral weight also deepened his humility. He did not claim that victory would redeem suffering automatically. He recognized that triumph could not resurrect the dead or erase grief. At best, it could justify continuation. This sober understanding prevented triumphalism and preserved seriousness as an operating principle. Through relentless war and relentless doubt, Lincoln became a figure of steadiness rather than inspiration. He did not lift the nation out of fatigue. He stood with it inside fatigue. This shared endurance created legitimacy more durable than enthusiasm. The people recognized a leader who did not escape the burden he asked them to carry. As momentum slowly turned, the war's end became conceivable, though still distant. Lincoln prepared himself not for celebration, but for reckoning. He knew that victory would bring its own trials, that exhaustion would not evaporate with surrender. The moral weight accumulated during these years would not disappear. It would demand resolution of a different kind. For now, the task remained persistence without illusion. Victory, if it came, would be incremental and costly. Doubt would remain necessary. Lincoln carried both forward, guided by a discipline forged through hardship and refined through loss, preparing for a final test that would measure not only military success, but the capacity to conclude violence without surrendering meaning. By the time re-election approached, despair was no longer episodic. It had become ambient, woven into the daily texture of leadership. Lincoln did not face the electorate from a position of confidence, but from endurance. The war had not been resolved cleanly. Victory remained partial, costly, and contested. The nation was tired, and so was its president. The question before the voters was not whether the struggle had meaning, but whether they still believed the man guiding it could carry them through what remained. The campaign unfolded under the shadow of uncertainty. Casualties continued. Progress arrived unevenly. Peace advocates pressed for negotiation, arguing that continuation bordered on cruelty. Others accused Lincoln of moving too slowly, of failing to crush resistance decisively. He stood between these pressures without relief, aware that either course could fracture the fragile legitimacy holding the war together. Personally, the strain deepened his isolation. He doubted not only the outcome, but the wisdom of asking the nation to persist under his direction. He questioned whether his leadership had exhausted public patience, whether a different voice might offer renewal he could no longer provide. These doubts were not performative. They were private, unguarded, and relentless. Survival at the ballot box felt uncertain, and uncertainty felt deserved. Yet the election itself became a referendum not merely on policy, but on endurance. Voters were asked to decide whether consistency mattered more than comfort, whether unfinished struggle justified continued sacrifice. Lincoln did not promise relief. He offered continuity. He argued that abandoning course midstream would not shorten suffering, only redefine it. This argument did not inspire enthusiasm. It demanded responsibility. The result, when it came, did not resolve his inner conflict. It confirmed trust without delivering peace. Re-election validated his legitimacy, but intensified his obligation. The nation had chosen persistence, and with that choice came renewed cost. Lincoln accepted the outcome without triumph. He understood that trust was not a reward. It was a burden. This survival clarified something essential. Leadership, he realized, was not sustained by certainty, but by credibility. The electorate had not endorsed his optimism. It had endorsed his seriousness. This distinction mattered. It meant that his authority rested not on illusion, but on shared recognition of difficulty. The people did not believe the war was easy. They believed he was honest about its cost. Inner conflict remained unresolved. He did not feel vindicated. He felt bound. The responsibility to conclude the war honorably now pressed harder than ever. He could not retreat into compromise that erased meaning, nor could he pursue victory without restraint. Re-election narrowed rather than expanded his moral margin. The campaign also exposed the fragility of democratic process under strain. Conducting an election during war tested the nation's commitment to its own principles. Lincoln recognized this as victory of a different kind. The act of voting itself affirmed the system the war sought to preserve. This realization steadied him, reminding him that endurance had already produced something worth defending. As the second term began, Lincoln's language softened further. He spoke less of enemies and more of wounds. He framed the future not as conquest, but as repair. This shift did not reflect fatigue alone. It reflected preparation. He understood that concluding the war would require not only military resolution, but moral transition. Re-election did not end despair. It confirmed that despair could be carried without surrender. Lincoln emerged from the process not renewed, but recommitted. The trust placed in him did not ease his doubts. It sharpened them into purpose. He would move forward, knowing that legitimacy had been granted, but absolution had not. The ballot box had preserved continuity. What remained was to determine whether continuity could deliver closure without betraying sacrifice. Lincoln stepped into this final phase, aware that time was narrowing, options were closing, and meaning would soon demand articulation beyond endurance. The trust confirmed at the polls now required transformation into a peace worthy of the suffering that had sustained it. As the war tilted unmistakably toward conclusion, Lincoln did not experience relief in the way others did. Victory, when it finally came into view, felt less like release and more like responsibility concentrating itself into a single, narrowing point. The cannon still spoke. The casualties still arrived. Yet the end was no longer abstract. It was close enough to demand imagination. And what Lincoln imagined was not triumph, but restraint. He understood how easily victory could become intoxication. Nations that win often mistake survival for moral license, power for permission. Lincoln resisted this impulse deliberately. He refused the language of conquest, avoided gestures of humiliation, and spoke instead of wounds, healing, and return. This was not naivety. It was a strategy shaped by conscience. He knew that how the war ended would determine whether it truly ended at all. Mercy in his thinking was not indulgence. It was prevention. Vengeance promised satisfaction, but guaranteed perpetuation. Punishment could silence armies, but it could not reconcile a fractured people. Lincoln's vision of peace rested on the belief that reintegration required dignity, not erasure. He did not deny guilt. He refused annihilation. This distinction infuriated those who demanded reckoning measured in suffering. Publicly, his tone shifted further toward humility. He spoke of shared responsibility, of collective failure rather than singular blame. He acknowledged the depth of division without inflaming it. In doing so, he risked appearing weak at the very moment power seemed absolute. Yet he believed that restraint exercised at the height of authority was the clearest measure of leadership. Privately, the cost of this vision weighed heavily. Mercy invited misunderstanding. It angered allies who had sacrificed deeply. It emboldened critics who mistook generosity for capitulation. Lincoln absorbed these reactions without retreat. He believed that justice, untempered by mercy, would become cruelty, and mercy unanchored from justice would dissolve into chaos. Holding both required discipline equal to any military campaign. He imagined peace not as erasure of conflict, but as management of memory. The war could not be forgotten, nor should it be. Its meaning had to be integrated rather than weaponized. This integration required language that acknowledged suffering without sanctifying hatred. Lincoln's speeches during this period reflected that effort, measured, reflective, and intentionally incomplete. Victory also confronted him with the future of freedom newly declared. Emancipation had altered the nation's moral landscape, but liberation without protection risked abandonment. Lincoln recognized that peace would test the nation's commitment to its own declarations. Mercy toward former enemies could not become indifference toward the newly free. Balancing these imperatives demanded a vision of justice expansive enough to include both restoration and responsibility. As the end approached, Lincoln appeared increasingly solitary. Those around him spoke of celebration, of closure, of reward. He spoke of work remaining. The contrast revealed his orientation. He did not experience leadership as an ascent. He experienced it as an accumulation of obligation. Victory added weight rather than subtracting it. In imagining peace built on mercy, Lincoln accepted that his vision might outlast his ability to enforce it. He knew that generosity offered could be rejected, that reconciliation required participation from those unwilling to engage. Yet he believed that setting the tone mattered, that initial posture could shape trajectory, even if outcomes remained uncertain. The war's conclusion loomed, and with it, the opportunity to choose what kind of nation would emerge. Lincoln chose restraint over retribution, coherence over catharsis. He believed that mercy, offered from strength, could stabilize what force alone could not. This belief did not promise harmony, it promised possibility. As victory solidified, Lincoln prepared to speak once more, not as commander, but as custodian of meaning. The words he would offer would seek neither applause nor absolution. They would articulate a peace measured not by dominance, but by the capacity to live with consequence without surrendering humanity. The nation stood at the threshold of ending violence. Lincoln stood at the threshold of defining what that ending would signify. In choosing mercy over vengeance, he accepted the risk that generosity might be repaid with resentment. He accepted it anyway, convinced that the alternative would bind the nation permanently to its own darkest impulses. Victory, for him, was not an ending. It was an opportunity to decide whether power would heal or merely conclude the war was ending. And with it came a fragile sense of release that had not yet learned how to breathe. Victory had arrived unevenly, leaving behind exhaustion rather than celebration. Lincoln stood at the precise moment where meaning was beginning to settle, where ideas spoken tentatively were about to be tested by peace. It was here, at this narrow crossing between intention and implementation, that death intervened. Assassination did not merely end a life, it arrested a transformation. Lincoln had not finished becoming what history would remember. His vision of mercy, still fragile, still contested, had not yet faced the compromises and resistances that peace would impose. The future he imagined remained unproven. In that instant, possibility hardened into memory, and memory began its slow conversion into myth. The violence itself was abrupt, almost banal in its execution, yet vast in consequence. A single act severed continuity, collapsing the distance between man and symbol. Lincoln did not fall as a conqueror crowned by triumph, nor as a ruler undone by failure. He fell as a custodian mid-task, his work articulated but unfinished. This incompleteness would shape everything that followed. Death simplified what life had kept complex. The doubts that had shadowed him receded. The hesitations that had defined his method faded from view. In their place emerged a figure of clarity, frozen at the height of moral seriousness. The man who had lived within contradiction was now remembered as the resolution itself. Myth began where uncertainty ended. The nation reacted with shock that quickly deepened into collective grief. Mourning unified what politics had divided. Loss created coherence where argument had failed. Lincoln's death allowed the country to feel together, if only briefly, transforming private sorrow into public ritual. This unity, however, was built on absence rather than agreement. It was powerful, but it was also temporary. Assassination also removed restraint. The voice most committed to mercy was silenced at the moment when mercy required defense. The balance Lincoln had sought between justice and reconciliation lost its anchor. In his absence, interpretations multiplied, each claiming fidelity to his intent while reshaping it according to urgency or resentment. Legacy became contested ground, yet the myth that formed was not hollow. It rested on genuine sacrifice and sustained discipline. Lincoln had earned reverence not through certainty, but through endurance. His death elevated this endurance into moral proof. The nation could now believe that meaning had been secured, even if its application remained uncertain. Transformation, frozen, became a template. Speeches were quoted, gestures were canonized, complexity softened. This simplification made Lincoln accessible across generations, but it also obscured the struggle that had produced him. The myth honored what he stood for, while risking forgetfulness of how he arrived there. In death, Lincoln became what life had resisted, a symbol without contradiction. The man who had lived inside doubt was now remembered as clarity. The leader who had balanced mercy against pressure was now claimed as endorsement for causes both restrained and severe. Legacy, once alive and evolving, hardened into reference. Immortality did not arrive for Lincoln with thunder or revelation. It arrived quietly, through repetition, memory, and use. His life, once marked by hesitation and doubt, settled into the nation's conscience, not as commandment, but as measure. Long after power faded, his presence remained, not as instruction completed, but as paradox endured. He became enduring precisely because he had been unfinished. The absence left by his death invited interpretation, and interpretation ensured relevance. Each generation encountered Lincoln not as an artifact, but as a question. How much restraint is required to wield power responsibly? How much patience can justice demand before it becomes denial? How much mercy can a nation afford without surrendering accountability? These were not answered definitively. They were modeled imperfectly. The paradox at the center of his life resisted resolution. He was decisive yet cautious, moral yet pragmatic, resolute yet burdened by doubt. History often prefers clarity, but Lincoln's endurance lay in complexity. He did not offer purity. He offered a process. He did not eliminate the contradiction. He confronted it openly and lived within it without surrender. Memory softened the roughness of his struggle without erasing it entirely. Over time, his words were quoted more often than his silences, his principles remembered more than his hesitation. Yet beneath the polish, the essential tension remained. He was great, not because he escaped uncertainty, but because he carried it without allowing it to corrode purpose. His legacy shaped conscience rather than policy alone. Leaders invoked him not merely to justify action, but to test it. Citizens measured themselves against his restraint when tempted by excess, against his empathy when tempted by indifference. Even misuse of his image testified to its power. To claim him was to acknowledge the moral terrain he had defined. The quiet weight of immortality lay in this continued relevance. Lincoln did not become obsolete because his solutions were incomplete. The nation continued to struggle with the same fundamental questions he had faced, though in different forms. Equality, unity, justice, and mercy remained contested. His life did not resolve them. It clarified how they might be approached without surrendering humanity. Over time, monuments rose, anniversaries were marked, and language settled into reverence. Yet the most enduring aspect of his immortality was not ceremonial. It was functional. His example was used when restraint felt costly, when compromise felt hollow, and when endurance felt unbearable. In those moments, his life offered not comfort, but companionship. Power fades, institutions change, context shifts. What remains is disposition. Lincoln's disposition toward humility, toward measured speech, toward moral seriousness without sanctimony, continued to shape expectations of leadership long after his authority ended. He altered the standard by which power itself was judged. The nation did not inherit certainty from him. It inherited responsibility. To remember Lincoln was to accept that progress required patience, that justice required endurance, and that mercy required strength. These lessons were not easy. They did not promise closure. They promised engagement. As time carried him further from lived memory into historical presence, his life resisted becoming static. Each crisis returned him to relevance, not as a solution, but as a lens. His paradox endured because the nation's contradictions endured. In this mutual persistence, his immortality found its ground. The quiet weight of his legacy did not demand reverence. It invited reflection. It asked whether those who wielded power could carry doubt without surrendering resolve, whether those who sought justice could temper urgency with empathy, and whether those who remembered sacrifice could honor it without exploiting it. Lincoln's life, settled into history, continued to shape conscience precisely because it never offered finality. It offered a way of moving through conflict without surrendering meaning. Long after the theater lights dimmed and the war's echoes faded, that way remained, asking each generation not to repeat his words, but to practice his discipline. And so his story does not end in silence, but in persistence. The man is gone. The questions remain. And in their endurance, his quiet immortality continues to weigh upon the nation, not as burden alone, but as guide.